You are listening to Ras Temari Radio, Offense Necessary, where we discuss everything but politics. Welcome back, everybody, and welcome back to our good friend Iman, who's back on.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being back. We were planning to have a whole conversation about the concept of self and other, and about healing. I think this goes with the theme of Mastarek, right? And to try and forgive one another, forgive oneself, and how to move forward as a community, and the whole concept of communal living, which is much more built into the fabric, I think, of Ethiopian society than it is, for instance, American society. So I guess a good way to start is to ask the usual question, Iman, what is something that you have taught yourself when it comes to these things?
What is something I've taught myself is, when it comes to healing, I had to really pay attention to different parts of my life, specifically 5 core points, which is my spiritual, my spiritual self, my mental state, my emotional state, and then my physical state. So I had to pay attention to each of these things and find ways to make myself, better, do better, evolve. When it comes to spirituality, I did a lot of research with different types of spiritual books, and I had to identify exactly what that meant to me, and what parts of spirituality from different religions that I could bring into my life so I could do better. When it comes to my mental state, first I had to be able to control my thought process. When I say control, I don't mean control every single thought that comes to mind, but the state of mind I'm in, basically, that I want to speak of state of mind, because sometimes you get into this negative thought processes, usually geared for me. It usually happens because I have an emotional reaction, a direct emotional reaction to a certain thought, and I keep myself in that thought process. So I had to learn how to balance my mental state, be able to look at negative things more objectively, and look at the things that I call positive, really identify whether those things are positive just for me or for other people as well. The third thing is my emotional state. So emotional intelligence, or the capacity to be able to handle your emotions, has been a very, very tasky. That's one of the things I have the most trouble with, because I react emotionally to a lot of things. So I had to learn how to, deal with that, live with that.
Is it fair to say that they say thoughts are often associated with emotions? Like, it's about dissociating emotions from thoughts.
Yeah.
You'll have a thought, and then that thought will bring back certain feelings,
Yes.
Especially memories, the recollection of something from the past, some trauma or something upsetting that affects you in the present.
Yeah.
And at that point, you're no longer really living, because you're no longer in the present, right? And it becomes difficult to function as well.
Exactly.
In that kind of state.
Yeah, it's like living on autopilot, because you have this thought process. Like, all these 5 things that I mentioned, they feed into each other. Your physical well-being defines how you feel emotionally, how you feel mentally, and how you feel spiritually. So you need to be able to take care of all aspects of your person or your physical state in this world. So your ability to take care of your body assures the fact that you'll have more space to handle things mentally or emotionally. Like, I know exercise does this for me, specifically yoga. Whenever I feel extremely frustrated about something, or I'm even extremely happy about something, I do a certain yoga ritual, and I feel like I'm high. Basically, it's like that natural, organic high that I give myself, and I also got myself to a better physical state, a state that I'm comfortable with now.
And you also practice meditation.
Yes.
And different kinds of meditation. And we should say there are a number of these meditation centers. You want to talk about some of these new meditation centers? This goes with the theme of Mastalal, right?
Yes.
Some of these meditation centers that have appeared in any number of places, including not too far from here in Wali Rwanda. Right?
Yeah. The place that I learned meditation, I took a 1 month meditation course at Cool Academy, and actually Cool Academy was a one-on-one session where people could get educated on different subjects, but specifically on meditation. Cool has been the cornerstone for me, because I go there every Sunday. There's a community meditation, and I used to go to community meditation. I learned how to do meditation for myself. I learned different types of meditation. There's mindfulness meditation, kundalini meditation. There's like chanting meditation, chakra meditation. It's different, and different things work for you. Like what you need in different parts of your life could be different things. Yeah. Just like that, meditation is.
And I think we should say up front, because so I did meditation, especially, I told you about this many years ago when I was towards the end of college, when I was in California. I went to some retreat in Central California in 10 days. One of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Didn't talk to anyone, didn't do anything except meditate for 16-hour days. You go through all kinds of ups and downs. I had a very powerful moment halfway through day 5 when I decided to lucid dream. Lucid dream is when you control your dreams, you're aware of dreaming, and you kind of become the master of your universe. I was on such a natural high from the meditation and realizing that I could do this, because I had gone halfway, so I knew I could do another 5 days, that I decided I'm going to have a lucid dream. It just kind of took over my subconscious mind in that moment. It's one of the most empowering things. This is just from delving down. But of course, 2 days later, I went into an emotional funk again. You go through all these ups and downs. But one thing I think is very important for our audience to understand. The first thing that they told us when I researched this is Vipassana. This is a Vipassana center. Goenka is the name of the teacher. And the first thing is, let's talk about what meditation is not. Because meditation is completely misunderstood. I know a friend of mine here who's not the most spiritual person. He's a very sciencey kind of guy. He was like, meditation, what, sitting around and like thinking intensely? And I'm like, no, meditation is like how to control, like how to, for the most part, most kinds of meditation are how to either control or kind of wipe your slate so you're not thinking, right? It's especially for people who have an overactive mind. Another thing that people are going to misunderstand, I think, is that these are specific religious practices, which they're not. I mean, in general, meditation is like prayer, in that prayer allows you to focus your mind and so on and so forth. But none of these practices, while they may be considered spiritual, and they might be associated with either the New Age thing or the hippie thing, obviously in Buddhism and a lot of Eastern practices, but they're not specifically necessarily religious, right? A lot of people think, oh, you have meditation, that means that you are a Buddhist or you are one of these people who belongs to an Eastern religious practice. No more so than, I mean, people can pray and not be Christian, or people can pray and not be, you know what I mean? Prayer is just sort of looking to a higher power or reminding yourself of all the things that you're grateful for or that you wishful thinking, you know what I mean? In the same way, meditation can be a matter of just practically trying to heal yourself or trying to control your thoughts or just get through the day for some people as well. So I just want to clear that up for a lot of people who think these are spiritual practices in a very specific kind of religious or Eastern sense.
Yes, I mean, like I said, there are different types of meditation. And depending on what you are seeking from that meditation, the things change, things change. First thing for me when it came to meditation was breathing. The first step you need to know about is breathing. Basically, like, you learn how to listen to your breath, control your breath, really pay attention to it. So how often do we pay attention to how we breathe? Because it has become such an automatic system that we have forgotten how to really guide our breath so that our body feels right, so that our mind feels right, so that we emotionally feel better. Psychologists will tell you to, in cases where you're like overwhelmed with emotion, a psychologist will tell you to breathe for a certain amount of time, maybe for 3 minutes. Take deep breaths. That's it. That's the basis of meditation. Any meditation you go to, the first thing you learn about is breath. And breath is important for anyone. Whether you're Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, it doesn't matter what religion you have, we all breathe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a basis for, and
Exactly.
I know, like, for instance, in Vipassana, the first 3 days of that meditation retreat that I was talking about, the first 3 days we were just focusing on the sensations in the triangle from the top of the upper lip to the tip of your nose. There are all these sensations that go on there. It's very minor, but you learn to really focus on these, and then you do that for 3 days, and then for 7 days you do one of the hardest things, which is the opposite of mindfulness, or I think transcendental meditation. Right. This is very, like, disciplined, very stern, rigorous. Like, when you have to scan your whole body from head to toe and back and forth, and focus on every inch of your physical. And it's difficult, it's rigorous, and also anytime your mind starts to wander, you're supposed to kind of get mad at yourself. It's like stern parenting versus the more lax parenting. The transcendental meditation is just let everything just go through your mind, and you start to observe how your mind moves. And it's almost like you develop another level of thinking beyond your mind, right? So we all have thoughts, and then we have thoughts about our thoughts, which can be a very difficult thing.
Yeah.
But then if you add another layer of your mind, of your thought process, which is consciously observing yourself thinking, sometimes observing yourself thinking about thinking, and that's that level of detachment. And that, we were talking about emotions and how it's associated with thoughts. Sometimes one strategy when you start really suffering is to think, to just reason it to death. Just keep reasoning it and reasoning it and reasoning it. And just control your mind such that you're thinking it through so much. People say don't think too much. Well, it's okay to think as long as you're not associating emotions to the thoughts. Instead you're combating that with more rationality until eventually you realize, what am I? And that rational mind overtakes that emotional one. But these are all different practices for people.
What that brought to mind for me is the concept of the monkey mind. Our mind is not necessarily trying to come against us when it does these things. It just likes to grind its teeth into problems. Like you give it a question and it grinds its teeth into that particular question, trying to find solutions, trying to disintegrate a problem. Whatever problem it is that you're thinking about, it will keep thinking about that because that is what it's meant to do. Right. So one thing that I like to use in meditation is I put my thoughts, whatever thought that I'm thinking while I'm doing my meditation, into a balloon.
Right, you told me about
a balloon, and then I let it fly away.
Yeah.
Once you put that image in your head, the thought actually does fly away. Yeah. Once it does fly away, you come back to your breath. Right. You listen to your breath. You count your breath if you have to. You align your breath with your heartbeat. Right. And when you go one step further, you go into the gap between your breath. You breathe in, and then there's a gap. You don't automatically breathe out without that gap. Right. Now you start paying attention to the gap, and then you start paying attention to all the different organs that are doing that breathing. Right. There is first, it goes through your nose if you're using your nose, and then you feel it going down your throat to your lungs, and then your
diaphragm. Right.
Exactly. And
diaphragmatic breathing, very, very important, right? For singers, for people who use a voice, breathing from your diaphragm, from your lower torso.
Exactly. And one funny thing that I learned, like I used to have this thing, you know how when you breathe out, all the air is supposed to move out of your body and your diaphragm retracts when you breathe out. But some people, their diaphragm actually, gets bigger, right? Like, it's almost as if they're doing the opposite of what they're supposed to do.
Right.
And you won't be able to notice this unless you're paying attention.
Right.
And I used to do this, and I had to teach myself to really understand what it means to really breathe and get all the toxic air out of my body and then bring it back into my body. It's like I said, meditation depends on what you're seeking from that particular meditation. If you're seeking a spiritual guidance, then you'll have to pay attention to spiritual things, as in your crown chakra, for example, is your portal to the spiritual realm. So you'll have to concentrate on your crown chakra and then the different chakras in your system. When I say chakra, I mean the energetic fields within your body. And then when it comes to your mental state, like I said, you could use the balloon concept. I learned this from Yoftahe, or Happy Being, at Kuhu Center. And on my meditation practice, he taught me about the balloon technique that's very good for your brain. When it comes to your emotions, the funny thing with emotions is like the first thing you have to do is allow yourself to feel that emotion fully. If it's anger,
Right.
if it's anger, you feel it fully.
Right,
You don't
because
react.
just like with your thoughts, if you fight it,
Yeah.
if you react or you get
It gets
upset,
bigger.
it gets bigger.
Yeah.
Right? It feeds it.
Yeah, and also you'll have thought process. You'll have a thought process that's based on that emotion.
Yeah.
So like it's also guiding your emotion, letting your emotion get you out of that toxic mental loop you've put yourself in.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think everybody should do their own research, and everybody should find out what type of meditation works for them.
Right.
Because for different people, different types of meditation work.
And you use the word, I think the key word again, mastawal in Amharic, attentiveness. It's all about being attentive. It's all about being aware, and not just kind of like being, because you'll often find that when you're not really paying attention to what you're doing or what's going on in your mind or whatever, when you kind of just let yourself kind of be taken over, then you'll think back and you'll be like, well, what was I doing? I wasn't even participating. I was just kind of like a passenger, allowing that whole situation to flow over. But I would also point out, this is something else that you talked about, which is, the counting of breathing and the counting. Again, for people who find this to be foreign or strange, oh, this is an Eastern thing, or this is a hippie thing, want to associate it to that box. People who you're told as a kid, oh, you can't fall asleep. Just imagine an image of goats and you're counting all the sheep, or count backward from 99 to 1, or the woman in Catholic Church especially, there's this whole thing about the old lady with the rosary beads who just sits and counts the rosary beads, who does the rosary, or all these similar practices that exist in other, in sort of what we would consider more traditional religions here. When it comes to prayer and that kind of thing. Again, it's all about trying to focus the mind. And in a sense, all these practices, religion, prayer, meditation, are all about trying to heal and really heal the conscious mind. That we're all faced with the same kind of struggle. Let's transition to something else I wanted to talk about that's related, which is the whole concept of self and other. We were talking about this. But there is a kind of a paradox, and maybe you could explain how the importance, the question of whether to proceed from egolessness, from being a person for others, and you get rewarded yourself in the process, or whether to build yourself, and how that kind of that process of the relationship between self and other, some of the conversations that we're having off air as far as how that proceeds.
Self and other.
Yeah.
Okay. So I believe in both of them in a way, because like I said, like different things work for different people. And I think where the whole work on yourself, and then after you have a full cup, then you can provide to others, that comes from that sense that every individual is meant for a purpose for this world. And as long as you're fulfilling that purpose to this world, you're doing your part in this world. You're making that dent you're meant to. Because there's no one else in this world like you. There's no one else in this world that will be created twice. Unless you're being resurrected. I don't know whether that thing works, It worked for Jesus Christ, but if resurrection is a thing, maybe you will have another person that is exactly like you. But if that's not the case, there's no one else like you. So coming from that mental state, coming from fulfilling a purpose into this world, then you can start from that. But then there are other people that do not have an identification of themselves, do not have an ego. They do not define themselves as this or that. They don't have a label. Even their name is of no consequence, because their purpose in this world is to be for others, to give a space for others to survive, to give a space for others to thrive, to evolve. That is their personal evolution. I've met different people in my world that have convinced me that living from your own true purpose, or living from what comes from within, is the best way to go. And I've also met people that told me that, like, you don't matter. It's the world around you that matters. It's the
ego
world
death, they call this, or
ego
egolessness.
Death. Yes. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding with ego. A lot of people think ego is a bad thing. I don't really think it's a bad thing. It's your ability to identify yourself. It's your ability to say, you know what, this is me, this is my name, This is what I do. You know, you can explain yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That's what ego is. But like, if your ego is overshadowing somebody else's needs, if your ego is overshadowing somebody else's ego, then that's a problem, because you are not fulfilling your purpose. You are not being of service to the community. You are only being of service to yourself, and you are doing that by hurting others. There are people who can argue that maybe that is your purpose, like Hitler was born for a reason. There are people who say that, like, he created a revolution, and that revolution was very toxic, but it also unraveled a lot of things.
Right. Why does God allow the devil to exist if God is all-powerful? Well, God also, in Christianity and in Judaism, offers free will. It's God's choice. Of course, God is all-powerful, but God chooses to carve out a space for us to make our own choices.
Exactly. And you can't exist in a world that's polarity. Polarity is like a constant in our world. Like, you'll have your bad days and then you'll have your good days. The trick becomes on whether or not you'll feel so overwhelmed by your good moments that you feel like you won't fall anymore. And then when you fall, you're just spiraling, like unraveling who you are. Because rhythm is a part of life. We go through our ups and downs. That's one thing. And then polarity, as much as there's darkness, there's light. As much as there's sweet, there's sour. Like, everything is created in these two teams.
Sure, and I mean, the Marxists call this dialectics. It's a whole theory that Hegel, that history is the change over time, is two antithetical things, two opposites pushing against each other in a struggle. And sometimes some people think once that's resolved, that conflict resolved, something new emerges out of it. Some people, there's all these different, but thesis, antithesis, and sometimes synthesis. This is dialectics. Polarity is one way to call it. Dualism, dichotomies. I mean, but there is this sense that things tend to proceed in opposites pushing against each other somehow. And then some people refer to this as metaphysics. Right? This is not really expressed in the physical, but the Marxists will swear that this is dialectical materialism. Right? There's actual materiality to this. But anyway, this does seem to come up a lot, two oppositional forces. When they teach Romeo and Juliet to students, they'll be like, oh, the Capulets, Juliet's family, and the Montagues, Romeo's family, express this, how society tends to divide along two forces, two tribes, two, the two-ness of everything. But anyway.
Yeah, and it brings to mind, like, movies. In every movie, there's different concepts, and they're arguing those concepts, whether it's a dialogue, or like there's a villain in a story, or even if he's not a villain, he's someone that like has a different state of mind than the main actor, or even if they're all that diversity, that polarity gives us the chance to create things that were not there before, that gives us the chance to like find the middle ground.
I know what you mean. It's often about, so much of life is about moderation, right? The myth of Icarus and Daedalus. Daedalus say, don't fly too close to the sun, but you don't want to go too far down either, because you're going to crash into the sea. Either one is going to bring you down into the sea, right? Because the kid is going to melt, his wings are going to melt from the sun, the wax of the wings, and it's going to bring him crashing down the sea. So you want to kind of fly in between. And so often that's what parents tell their kids, just like Daedalus says to Icarus, hey, don't study too hard, don't play too much, you know what I mean? Just kind of keep everything in balance and moderation. But that's difficult to do, again, because the mind, if not checked, tends to go down these gyres, tends to go down into these sort of self-reinforcing loops where we practice one kind of behavior, and that's when we lose our sense of moderation or balance.
I noticed this in the concept of like staying logical and being emotional. This is something that people have said to me, like, you're rational thought, you have to be logical. People who demand logic from themselves constantly suffer, because they cannot deny the fact that their emotions exist. They're still there. They just deny that and call it, find a logic to make themselves not feel that. Or people who are emotional deny logic to allow themselves to feel whatever emotion that they are feeling.
Right.
But the reality is we exist in between these two realms, and it's our ability to balance those things out that allows us to live a more fulfilled and a life that is meant for us.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's often about balance. It's also about living that extended life. It's funny, this entire time I keep thinking back to what you said about uniqueness, about how every individual is completely different. The more you get to know people, the more you'll notice, especially if you're in an interesting place. Right? Like I just was in a vibrant place. Like people you socialize with, everybody is so different. Yeah. Everybody has a completely different mentality, completely different approach, a completely different personality, a completely different, and everybody's, this is also the Jesuit approach to education, which I always refer back to because I was sort of educated by the Jesuits. And as a teacher, I was taught by the Jesuits, right? This order of Catholic priests. Their whole thing is everybody's different. You address this, you reach the student on their level. I was relating this to the service industry, how they tell you, waiters will tell you, you don't treat people how you want to be treated. You treat people how they want to be treated. Mm-hmm. Well, the student as well, you're not fulfilling your own needs when you deal with the student as a teacher. Yeah. You are addressing, everybody has different personalities, different pacing. This is why small class size is important. This is why teacher-to-student individual interaction is important. You reach a student on their level and you address their specific needs because you're there to cater to them and not the other way around. Yeah. But all this is to say, when we were talking about uniqueness, there are legitimate reasons that people think life is an illusion. Right? This comes up in I think in Hindu thought also. Life is illusory, one way or another. Our experience is so subjective that we can't say that we ever grasp objective reality or that we know it even exists. Mm-hmm. But the reason I say this is, think about all the things that had to happen for any one of us to be right here, right now. Yeah. It's impossible. It's mathematically impossible that this is happening right now. How many people, in order for an organism to spring up, a child to be born, how many ancestors, the further back you go, the more ancestors you have. 10,000 years ago, maybe like half the population of the world were your ancestors, right? Especially because it's a smaller population of the world. And the further back, you have grandparents, there's 4. Great-grandparents is 8, or 2, 4, 8, and so on. So everybody essentially far back enough is your ancestor. Mm-hmm. And how many, let's say, couples had to emerge, and how many acts had to take place, and how many chance encounters to bring any one person. And then you consider life on, I think I mentioned this to you off air as well. I love the way this was mentioned in a book called My Name is Red by the Turkish author Orhan Pamuk. It starts off, it's magical realism. It's a guy who has just been killed. Mm-hmm. And it's a murder mystery told from the perspective of the guy who was just killed. Okay. Who was just murdered.
So he's the narrator?
Yeah, he's the narrator. He's trying to it's a whodunit. He's trying to figure out who killed him. Okay. But he has no effect on the story because he's dead, right? Yeah. But he's realizing what death is in the moment that after his life ends, and he goes, I was dead for the longest. I wasn't alive for an eternity, and then I was born. Very briefly, I lived, and now I'm facing eternity. He goes, I never thought about it before, and most of us don't. He says, I've been living luminously, a sliver of light caught between 2 eternities of darkness. Mm-hmm. What are the chances that any one of us is alive at this point, at any point in time, and either not born yet or dead? It's mathematically impossible. It's an eternity before and an eternity after, right? So the possibility is infinitesimally small to the point of being impossible. Just the chances that any one of us would come into this world and be uniquely ourselves is the result of a mathematically impossible series of things that had to happen exactly as they did. And when you put that together, this is why people are saying things like maybe consciousness and all human experience of the earth itself is a computer simulation. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it's a figment of some child's imagination, some autistic child, and in a hospital somewhere there's a TV show like this, and where we found out, I forget what it was called, but the last episode you discovered that the whole TV show was in the mind of an autistic child, looking into a snow globe or something like that. Because so many of these things mathematically do not line up, or logically do not line up, at least in terms of logic or mathematics as we currently understand it.
I think that has a lot to do with our understanding. The reason I say every individual is unique and there's a purpose to that individual is there's a specific DNA that you have that nobody else has.
Sure,
Specific types of people had to come together. And even with you, between you and one of your siblings, there is a fundamental difference. And that difference can come from the way your DNA is activated. What parts of your DNA is activated. The types of karmas that, the traumas that you are supposed to heal in your life and the traumas that your sibling is supposed to heal in their life is going to be completely different. So, I mean, I think that it is so perfect the way that we're created, the way that we're living our lives. It's so perfect. Because we do not know of what is perfect, it's completely hard for us to understand.
Right.
Okay, so let me explain this further. I mean, we don't really know perfection. We know a certain, there's something missing all the time because we're meant to be curious. We're meant to change things. We're meant to, fix things. Even, you can live a satisfied life, but you still need a few things more to even feel even more satisfied, or,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But at the same time,
it's a process that corrects itself.
Exactly.
Right. It's almost like we're headed towards. This is also a lot of people have taken Darwin and the concept of evolution. See, we're as if we're evolving to the omega point. There was this interesting movement under this guy Pierre Teilhard de Chardin in the early 20th century, where he was trying to reconcile because people hated Darwin. And a lot of people, I still hear it in Ethiopia, traditional Christian type people say, "What
it's been disproved, right?"
They say all kinds of things, and they get angry, and they'll be like, because there's also Christian humanism involved, where human beings do not like to be thought of as animals. When even that is a dialectic. In a sense, we're animals. In a sense, we're above the animals at the same time, right? So this is a dialectic between the human and the post-human. But people think to themselves, well, I can't be an ape. They get angry. You're saying I evolved from a monkey? I'm like, no, you didn't evolve from a monkey. You evolved. The monkey is along the path of evolution. You evolved from a single-cell organism, right? You evolved from a piece of bacteria in the water, right?
Exactly.
And by the way, religion says, Christianity says, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So if you're willing to come from ash and go back to ash, I don't see why you're so offended by the monkey, right? But
yeah, it reminds me of this joke. I really love this joke. Okay, so there's a family. There's the mother, the father, and the child. So first, the child goes up to his mom and asks her, "Mom, where do we come from?" And she tells him about Adam and Eve. She tells him the story of Adam and Eve and of the angels and stuff like that. And then he goes up to his dad and is like, "Yo, Dad, where do we come from?" And he tells him that, like, the Darwin concept, we evolved from monkeys and stuff. And then he goes back to his mom and says, like, "Mom, you told me that we came from Adam and Eve and from the angels, and Dad told me we came from monkeys." And then she's like, "Well, he was telling you about his side of the family, and I was telling you about my side of the family."
That's good. That's a good joke. That's a good joke. So there was an attempt. I started this whole thing with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. That is a really good joke. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, this French guy who was like, well, there is a way to reconcile Darwin with and the idea. I mean, Darwin also there's a racial aspect to Darwin. Like people, social Darwinism, the idea that black people are seen as not having been as evolved as white people, and so on and so forth. But or that's one way people pervert Darwin. Not that Darwin himself is arguing that in The Origin of Species, but the idea that we're on a linear trajectory, and even I mentioned Marx, Hegel, they also believe this. A lot of people now are like, dude, history does not work that simply. It's not on this linear progressive trajectory. There are setbacks. There's a million different trajectories going on at the same time. But still, this is the idea: is we're headed on this linear. This is when you were talking about perfecting yourself, right? Mm-hmm. Like reaching perfection. That it's the process. It's the journey. Right, so just as evolution, we're on a path towards evolving towards being like God, is what Pierre de Chardin is saying. Yeah. And again, this plays into the racial biology stuff a little bit too much, right? Okay. But the idea, because obviously humanity evolved from Africa, but still, the idea is that evolution, we are evolving towards the omega point, and the omega point is when human beings finally reach the point of destiny of God. This is also very optimistic. Because a lot of people will say, wow, look at the destruction that happens in the 20th century, right around the time Pierre Teilhard, he wrote, I think, he was active before Hitler, right? But that kind of level of destruction in World War II and so many wars since then goes in a different direction. I think of this, and one last point I'll make, because I'm going off on a number of directions here, but people, I think I mentioned this when we were talking about history, people who were around in the days of the student movement, in the 60s and 70s in Ethiopia, and who remember, a lot of our parents, a lot of older people remember when entire portions of Africa were on the map belonging literally to England or to France. Right? It was a completely different way of...
French America, Italian America,
absolutely.
English America.
Yeah,
and
Africa.
Africa, my bad. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I mean, you might say that America still has that...
a little bit.
Yeah. No, but so there's all these processes are taking place. All these struggles are taking place. And people are fighting for something greater in the 60s and 70s. And there's all this hope is in the air. And then it goes off in the wrong direction. But anti-war, anti-Vietnam, and all this reform, and even churches are reforming, the Catholic Church in Vatican II, and civil rights movement, black people are finally being free in the United States. The idea that 50 years later, 60 years later, I mean, for people then to imagine 2020 is like us sitting and trying to imagine 2070 or 2080. Yeah. And the idea that people would be fighting over ethnicity, over tribalism, over sexuality, over nationality, over race, and that would be the obsession more so then, and that people have abandoned the idea of a higher cause or higher progress, that seems to go completely against what Teilhard de Chardin, all these optimists, or even Marx were saying, which is history is headed in a progressive direction, and human beings are constantly perfecting one another. Some people believe in devolution, right? That human beings, as they evolve, are also devolving spiritually, and so that's another dialectic between progress and devolution.
There was this video I saw once. It talked about the precession of the equinox. Right. So there's one point the Earth reaches aligns with this particular star, and at that moment human beings evolve, and then they devolve mentally, and then evolve again, and then devolve mentally. So whenever the precession of the equinox shifts, then it's like the time for the rise. There's different concepts that talk about this, but I think it's each and every single individual's decision to either focus on these concepts of ethnicity, religion. It's your decision whether or not to focus on separation or unity. These two things exist. So would you
another dialectic?
Yes. Would you rather work towards unity or separation? If you're working towards separation, your ethnicity will matter to you. You're individualizing. You're putting yourself into this separate, body that you are, and you're separated. Like, your religion matters to you, your ethnicity matters to you, the place you were born matters to you. There are different ways you can separate yourself from another person. You can even separate yourself within four walls. But if your purpose is unity, then you find all the reasons why you're united with another human being. The fact that you're a human being. You're united with the animal because you also have, animalistic behaviors. You could choose to unite yourself to whatever is around you, or you could choose to separate yourself. So at the end of the day, it comes to choice. We have that free will. If you'd rather focus on separation, that is a purpose in your life that you're meant to fulfill. Whatever you separate, the person who's meant to unite things, unites them. And then this kind of sync happens. And it's meant to happen as well, because the more we expand, the more ideas evolve, and the more concepts that we really need to pay attention to. So if there is, a failure in a system or a failure in a community, you have to address that failure. You can't ignore it. You can't pretend as if it's not there. You can look at separation and deny the fact that it exists, or you could look at separation and find a way to unite, right? So it comes back to choice. It comes back to choice, I believe.
I think especially in times when, that's really well said, and I think it's especially when it comes to times where people are fighting everywhere, wars, not just in this country, but civil wars and all kinds of splintering along these lines, along those lines. Yeah, consensus building, right? Unifying, seeing what you have in common. What I enjoy most about my relationship with self and other is what I see as my strength, and what I try to bring to this station, but also when I interact with someone socially, is I want to meet someone who is as different from me as possible and find common ground with that person on their level, a little bit like the Jesuit thing, the teaching thing, right? Oh, you come from Finland, and I start mining in my head, what is some reference I can make to Finland? Is there a TV show I've seen about Finland? There's a goofy little pop culture phenomenon from Finland from 35 years ago. Like, well, Finland, okay, I don't know anything about Finland. Maybe the neighboring country and their relationship with anything. I just mentioned Finland because I literally don't know anything about Finland, right? But like, that to me is really the goal. At the same time, I want to complicate this a little bit. Because Timothy was in here, or Timothy, Timothy was in here, older Black American gentleman. We were talking about Black history. We talked about the Panthers, and we both agreed that the Panthers' real contribution was the idea of dividing, but in a useful way, right? Because they had read Marx, right? They had read Maoism and all of that, and they knew about communism, but their take was communitarianism, which is similar in that it's about taking care of other people and communal bonds and so on. Mm-hmm. But Marx, one of the many problems with Marx, right, is that everything is universalized. It's one size fits all. And the guy was honestly, a lot of people try to deprovincialize Marx, like try to relate him to other areas. But the guy was sitting in the 19th century in a library in Germany. He knew everything from reading newspapers, and he knew everything that was going on in Western Europe. Everything. Right? Incredible brilliant. He didn't know anytime he tries to talk about India or Africa, he sounds like an ignorant person, as you might imagine, right? He even has an interesting piece towards the end of his life on the Civil War in the United States. But again, he's not really informed, right? Not his fault. But this is the problem, is that when you try to universalize things and you try to build one size fits all, and so the Panthers thing was, in that sense, they were the opposite, which is, what does my neighbor need, right? Their whole thing about tracking the police and following the police when they were following black men or black people was to go up to the police as they were harassing that person and recite that person's rights and know the law entirely in order to protect them. So it wasn't an antagonistic thing the way people understand it, where they were trying to take on the man, and there was all this black nationalism, all that. There was some of that, but it was really about meeting the needs of the community is being harassed and terrorized by the police. This is one way. So then they're like, what are, within the framework of communitarianism, what are some of the other needs of the community that we can meet? So they're talking about housing. They're talking about making sure people have water, making sure people have food, right? But every community is different, just like every individual is different, right? Exactly. So as much as we try to build consensus, we got to be careful too that sometimes it's good to actually splinter into fragmented communities and address them on the micro level. And so there's that aspect of it too, right? The opposite aspect that sometimes looking at, and that goes back to the conversation that we were having about self and other, right? About empowering your neighbor. Look out before you start worrying about electing the president of the United States, or I mean, in America right now, this is actually a grating thing in America because of the media. Everybody watches the same. All politics is national. Nobody has any regional concerns. Nobody in Idaho is voting for the president thinking about what are they going to do for Idaho. Very few people. All politics is national. Everybody's watching the same news. Everybody's, everything is 300 million people, one community. And as we were talking about off air, very few people compared to Ethiopia. This is one area where I love Ethiopia. Very few people know their neighbor's name, or if they do, they don't get into their neighbor's. But everybody kind of lives in this individual bubble. And so people have this awareness about the national community of 300 million people of the United States, but they have no communal awareness of what's happening in their neighbors' lives or taking care of their neighbor, right? And that's kind of what the Panthers meant by communitarianism, right? So sometimes dividing, if it's a conscious effort to try and target the needs of the immediate community, the immediate surrounding, can actually be a positive.
It can. The most detrimental thing is looking at a separatist's state of mind and denying the fact that separation exists. Because one of the most toxic things that has happened to black people is the denial of racism.
Right.
Racism exists, but there are people who deny it to your face even while they're racist. That is more detrimental than actually admitting that separation exists and you notice it.
Right. Actually, that's the core to racism is denial, or any kind of injustice is denial. Right?
Even with unity, when you're denying that unity exists, it's more detrimental to you. When you're denying that another human being sitting next to you, whatever race, religion, or sexual orientation that they have, is actually a human being and deserves to live this life, that is detrimental. It's denying the reality of things. It's rejecting, disowning, and denying what is real. what actually exists. And the Panthers movement, they paid attention to the separation that existed and catered to the community that they felt the most united to.
Right.
Right? And not only them, like there are white people that have like literally become a part of the black community, you know, have supported them, you know, have been actually united themselves into that community.
Yeah,
even
they
though
exist,
like physically they're different, but they acknowledge that separation. They don't deny it.
Yeah.
They acknowledge the fact that it exists, and they do something about that, you know, like they use that actual separation for a good cause.
Yeah. I know white people, not too many of them, but I know I've met a handful of white people in America and even here who are genuinely more comfortable with black people than they are with white people. And it's a very interesting thing. I find these people fascinating, and I think maybe they had some issues with their family or their community or something, or maybe they just, as children, you know, they had a lot of black friends or something. But it does happen, and it's an interesting thing that people can relate on other bases. But I think the point you make about denial is really important, because common sense dictates that the first step to solving a problem is acknowledging it.
Mm-hmm.
And the opposite of acknowledgement is denial. Right? So you can never solve a problem as long as you deny its existence. And when it comes to, I think we talked about this with Timothy, if I recall, but one of the most interesting aspects of the history of racism in America is denial. And during slavery days, the slave owners used to deny the existence of racism. They felt that they were providing shelter and food and to these heathens in Africa. And I mean, they knew that they weren't. They knew they were brutalizing these people, but they dealt with such guilt that they had to tell themselves that they were, you know, good people.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, now that sounds crazy, right? But in their letters, they would often write, "Oh, you know, I actually love my servant or my slave," right? And then in the 60s, there's all these polls Gallup conducted back in the 60s that showed that the majority of white people, including liberals, if you put them all white people in America together, believed in the 50s and 60s, when there was segregation in entire places in America, where there was no political representation, etc., that racism didn't exist and that black people were just complaining for no reason. They get all the same rights that we do. Again, today that sounds crazy. And any reasonable person, 95% of the American people probably today, would admit that there was racism during slavery and during the Jim Crow era and all that. And yet, so this is the argument that I would make to anybody who wants to deny it now. It's like, okay, things are better now than they were back then. No question. Nobody's denying that. Things are progressing, a la Teilhard de Chardin or Marx. But what are the chances that the people who were right all along, and we know who was right back then, are suddenly wrong now when they continue to say that racism exists, and the people who were wrong all along are suddenly right? Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, is it really going to flip on a dime like that? You know. Yeah. So that's the argument I would make, because you're right. You hit it on the nail. The denial of not just racism, sexism, homophobia, any kind of systematic injustice, it exists on denial. Yeah. Because if you acknowledge it, then nobody can justify it. You know, once they acknowledge it.
Yeah. And justice doesn't really pick. That's the thing with justice. Like, everybody deserves justice. It doesn't matter whether, like, you're a killer or not. Maybe there's a reason why you're a killer. You know, even the criminals, even the people that we consider to be the worst representations of humanity. Even they deserve justice if something has happened to them. And that's very hard for a lot of people to understand. Because one thing I've noticed, I've never actually been to America or experienced any type of racism. I've lived in Ethiopia for most of my life. So one thing I've seen though, from conversations, one thing that I've noticed is some people felt that black people deserved what they got because they're mostly criminals. You know, there's gunshot here and gunshot there, and they never take care of themselves. They had excuses for why a person does not deserve justice. And It just made the problem worse. The worst thing I feel like while we're talking about denial is self-denial. It got to the point where a person felt like they had to deny themselves in order to fit in a community that doesn't really accept them. Mm-hmm. So they had to create their own community so that they wouldn't exist in that feeling of self-denial. Because so many people around you deny you enough times, then, you start denying yourself. You start believing things about yourself that are not really true. And then that becomes who you are. So denial has a lot of aspects to it. But the worst state I feel is self-denial.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're denying yourself, you're also denying your purpose in this world. You're denying your uniqueness in this world. Whether you try to be as specific as you possibly can about it, or as general as you possibly can about it, at the end of the day, if you're denying something, you're just causing more issues. You're just ignoring something that really needs attention.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the first step. The first step is identify that you have a problem. Realize, you talk to an addict or somebody who's out of control. Well, wait. First, you have to accept that you're an addict, that you have this problem, and then you can come up with a plan. Yes. Right, and then you follow through on the plan. But none of that happens if you continue to deny the problem, right? And there are all these things, these tactics. So the book I'm writing is working on this. People who rise up from positions of historical subjugation and the problems that are there and how this keeps people in certain positions rather than others. But there are all these different ways of efforts of denial. So for instance, the model minority concept. The Asian American is the model minority. Well, there are all kinds of reasons that Asian Americans do better than other minorities besides the fact that they're just better people or harder working or any other racist trope. But this feeds the racist trope. And it feeds the effort of denial. Well, Asians are doing well. Well, how come? Well, not everybody immigrated to the country the same way. And Asians, like a number of other communities, tend to be drawn into certain professions and be there on student visas, etc. You know what I mean? There's a lot of complicated reasons for that. There's also the whole question of mean, median, and mode, right? The larger the group, the more there's a return to the law of averages. There aren't that many Asians. There aren't that many Jews. Smaller groups tend to do better, be statistical outliers to so it's a complicated thing. But even the existence of someone like Barack Obama or Oprah, I think, again, we're going back to a lot of the conversations we had with Timothy. Okay. The Barack Obama, Oprah Winfrey, Jay-Z, there's some social mobility always. There's some space for social mobility in capitalism. And that includes social mobility for minorities. And they're usually very visible. Okay. They're usually actors, they're usually entertainers, they're usually politicians who are actors and entertainers more and more. And this feeds this guy can make it, as if the fact that someone has overcome an obstacle means that the obstacle never existed in the first place, right? But there are all these strategies that exist in the media, and especially conservative media, especially in that are aimed at denial. And part of the reason for the existence of denial, this is really perverse, is that people feel guilty. People feel guilty. That slave owner felt guilty. That slave owner is a person. They might be a brutal, horrible person, but in the movie 12 Years a Slave, I love how they show this. Because one day, Michael Fassbender, my favorite scene in that movie, as powerful as that film is it's actually a weirdly comic scene, where Michael Fassbender comes home drunk, and he wants to party, and he has nobody to party with, so he goes and wakes up the slaves. And he has them dance for him, and this is also why black people are pulled into entertainment. But, he's a guy, he's just lonely, and he wants the slaves to So there are all those forces as well, right? That they feel there's a feeling of guilt, and instead of feeling guilty about something that you can't help your social conditioning, you can't help it, and there's no reason to feel just because you're white and American that you should feel guilty. I mean, it's any more than you should feel guilty for anything else you are. Yeah. But certainly, it's a perversion of that feeling of guilt, of that principled moral feeling of this is not right, I'm privileged or whatever. It's a perversion of that to then be like, okay, so that means I should deny. I feel so guilty that I should die. Now you've become part of the problem, right? Now you should feel guilty, right? Inherently, why should you feel guilty about what you were born into? I don't even believe, I'm a big fan of the principle of neutrality. I believe that inaction in the face of injustice is completely legit. I have no problem with it. I don't think anyone has a moral obligation because I don't believe in moral authority. So if you see somebody drowning, it'd be great if you jumped in and pulled them out of the water, but don't feel obligated to. Okay. My viewing is it's okay to be neutral. So people should not feel like they have to do something. I do not feel that white people or men, when it comes to feminism or anything, have an obligation. If you want to do it, do it. But if you start putting that obligation, that feeling of guilt, that weight of guilt on people, the danger is that it gets perverted, and then that contributes to the efforts at denial. And that becomes the problem, right? Yeah. Instead of the solution. You know what I mean?
I do. And also, I think the denial of a problem also has its basis in the fact that people don't even know they're doing something wrong sometimes. right? They
Right.
deny that problem. You know it's a problem. You can see it, but they can't because they don't think it's wrong. It's not something wrong that I'm doing. It's just what is and like what's right. You believe that something you're doing is right. So for other people, it's denial. For you, it's, you know, like it's your reality.
Right.
So also like seeing how ignorant you are, like really sitting down and writing down your values and trying to decide whether those values are based on authentic, genuine, heartfelt or compassionate reasons, or if they're based on like, you know, what society told you or what you have believed for a very long time, because human beings are meant to evolve. And if your thought process is meant to evolve, you have to give yourself that kind of time so you could, you know, solve whatever issues that you have.
Yeah.
And yeah.
What you were talking about, everything being a process.
Yes.
Right? It's not perfect from the beginning.
It's
You
not.
kind of move towards, and it sounds like you a lot of these spiritual practices and a lot of the reading that you do is very practically applied kind of thing, where you're trying to improve. This is the whole definition of self-help.
Yeah.
Right? You learn from your mistakes. You accept that you're human. You accept that you have certain thoughts that are intrusive. You expect that you have certain emotions that are intrusive.
Yeah.
And you just try to build on your experiences and on your knowledge
Exactly.
to constantly improve yourself. And maybe, getting back to the theme of self and other, maybe by learning for yourself, you then have something to impart, as hopefully we are doing right now,
Exactly.
impart for others. Because it's so interesting how everybody's the same at the same time that they're different. Right? Like we talked about how everybody's unique, but so much of what we think we experience by ourselves, especially when we're suffering, we think it's just me. And yet it is, I mean, it's how we deal with it. But the reality is everybody, almost everything that you deal with, it's incredibly universal. This is the cathartic aspect of stand-up comedy, especially observational comedy.
Okay.
You know, what Jerry Seinfeld does. You ever notice, and he'll mention some really tiny thing, you know, like observational comedy would be like, you know, you ever notice that how annoying it is when you brush your teeth before you drink the orange juice in the morning, and then the combination of the taste of the orange juice and the have you noticed this?
Yeah, I
right.
have.
So
of course.
so that's something that everybody who drinks orange juice and brushes their teeth sometimes forgets the order you're supposed to do that in, and it's gross, right? There's that weird flavor that they order. But when you do it, especially when you're a kid, you think it's just, or you don't consider that this is an experience that, you know, an enormous. Exactly. And so that means that, I mean, you know, besides like basic things like try to make sure to drink the orange juice first, right? The idea that so much of our human experience, you know, a million people, 10 million, 100 million people have been through it before you and will go through it after you, right? That can be a healing thing, just keeping that in mind, you know. A friend of ours who's a friend of the station once said to me, you're probably, if you have kids, you're going to be the ancestor of someone. And your great grandchild is not going to care what you did, except for the fact that you had your parents in Elizabeth.
Unless you do something very significant and like, you
unless
know,
you're
like,
Hitler or something.
Oh no.
But like, I mean, what do you mean?
Well, unless you do something significant, why would your great grandchildren think about you? Unless like your family's telling them stories about you and stuff like that. Another thing I would like to mention is like people have to stop having a problem with being wrong or being a fool, because everybody has that moment, you know. I think the biggest problem, the biggest cause of denial is the fear of being wrong,
making yourself look bad.
You know, being bad, being wrong is not something that is only one person's problem. Like, we are all wrong, we're all bad in our own particular ways, we all hurt each other, we all do this. If we are afraid of the fact that we're wrong, if we are afraid of the fact that we have actually the capacity to be bad people, then we won't stop and, you know, look at ourselves enough to change it. You cannot change something that you still feel. If you're constantly saying, I'm right, if you're constantly building your ego, and your ego is bigger than whatever the community needs, whatever your world needs, your society needs, then you become the only type of person in the world. And oh, what a shame that would be. Imagine if every single person thought the same way. Nothing would change. Nothing would evolve. We'd never realize the concepts that would have been dragging us down. But never evolving is not really, it's not fun. I don't find it fun, you know? Like, if you're constantly, like, this the same person throughout your life, and nothing changed, and then your ancestors is the same type of people.
Life would be boring.
It would be hella boring.
Yeah, it would be boring.
And we wouldn't have the capacity to, build the buildings that we built, or, now we have realized the fact that we cut down trees to build our buildings is messed up. I feel that's very messed up, because you have to take care of plants as well. Like, they are the reason you're alive, whether you decide to admit it or not. And even in your mental state. Like, if you are in a natural environment, an environment that has never been touched by mankind, when I say never been touched, I mean, like, when the trees are not cut down, the water's not polluted, the amount of peace you feel is incomparable than what you would feel in the city. For me. Like, at least for me, like, and everybody I've interacted with, there's a certain sense of peace and unity that comes to you when you are in that kind of environment. Yeah. And we had to evolve to the point where we built ourselves homes, but then we also evolved further to understand the fact that, hey, look, me building a building does not have to take away from another being's life. That's a being, that's a living thing. Taking care of that living thing is your responsibility. As long as you are a living thing, that's your unity with that particular plant. You are a living thing. So taking care of another living thing, you have to admit that you're wrong. If you're cutting down a tree to build your house, yeah, you found shelter for a little while, but that tree lost its life.
Yeah. Do you think if you see somebody else cutting down that tree, say you're not involved, this goes back to my whole thing about neutrality. I feel very strongly with that, because I believe there's no such thing as a moral absolute. Nobody has moral authority over anybody else. And that makes it hard for me to accept even the concept of moral obligation, except for to in your own actions. This is a lot of the problem with the police force, right? The police is there to impose the society's idea, and this is why now in the United States one of the biggest issues is with the police. The police has the ability to use force against other people, and then it's exposing all the deeper racial issues. But so I guess what I'm saying is, it's one thing to say you can't cut down that tree, but if somebody else comes along and cuts down that tree, do you have a moral obligation to stop them?
I believe in standing for the things that I hold core to my life. I believe in objectivity, but I don't necessarily believe in neutrality. I don't feel like I'm neutral in every kind of situation. I do my best to be as objective as I possibly can, but I will do my best so that tree won't be cut. Create other solutions so there's a win-win situation.
Right.
Maybe you can build your house around the tree or beside the tree, or use different types of elements to build that house so you wouldn't have to impact another life. I would make those arguments.
Right.
It's not because it's an obligation. It's something I believe in, and it's something that I want to share into the world, and I believe in standing with those beliefs. Not necessarily saying that I'm the only one that's right and this is what's supposed to happen. This is the way I live my life. Right. But I will come up to you and make my arguments. If you decide, I don't care what you have to say, my house means more and I want a big house, I don't want a tree in my environment, hey, that's your life, But I will say my piece.
Yeah.
I will say my piece, because if it actually does resonate with you, then, we can move further. We can, build on that, evolve from that.
Yeah, I agree. Saying your piece is always justified. I guess my issues with the question of obligation and authority, possibly because depending on what you mean by objectivity, I'm not sure I buy the idea of objectivity. It's likely that there's an objective world out there. That this, I think so. I have sense perception, but I don't know that I can perceive anything in any other way that isn't conditioned by my own mind or by my own subjective processes of perception, and that's probably true of everybody. So I guess what I mean is that's why I believe in neutrality, because nobody really knows, right? Like, and also, not only are you not able to be 100% confident in how you perceive things as they are, but nobody really knows what effect their actions are going to take, right? And nobody can anticipate, like, hey, maybe when I try to help, I'll give you an example. I told you this off air yesterday, that I became politically aware or politically interested when I was living in the United States in high school during the Iraq War. And the Iraq War is what gave me this real sense of opposition to civilizing mission and all the moralistic. I mean, it's one thing that white people did all the things, colonialism, slavery, genocide, all over the world, or certain white people, not all white people, right? But certain white people did that. It's another thing that they did so all the while insisting that they're the civilized ones and everybody else is a savage, and convincing all these natives that they're savages and that they're there to civilize them with Christianity or whatever the case may be. So, like, to me, coming up in the during the time when the United States government wasn't even able to protect its own citizens, 3,000 of whom were slaughtered, some of them in the capital, in the Washington D.C., at the epicenter of and they felt that they had the right, the obligation, the duty, the resources to go halfway around the world and free another country of a dictator who had nothing to do with any of the, you know what I mean? So this was so rife with problems to me, but people were easy to manipulate at that period because they were angry, they were fearful, they were nationalistic.
Yeah, emotionally driven.
Emotionally driven, and there was no logic to that whole run-up. They spent a year debating the war in Iraq. It was debated for a year, from 2002 to early 2003, about 9 months. All anybody was talking about was whether or not to go to war in Iraq, and nobody was, or very few people were thinking rationally about it, and whether or not because it didn't make any sense on any level, especially in retrospect. But it is motivated by that belief of meddling in other people's business, or that somebody, the United States is Team America World Police, right, to use the title of the famous film. To me, that oriented me so much politically. That's why I have this principle of neutrality, of like live and let live. Like, not because there's anything good about Saddam Hussein. Nobody likes Saddam Hussein, right?
Some people do.
Well, now people think that Iraq was probably better off with Saddam Hussein, but very few people. I mean, even within Iraq, the majority was oppressed by Saddam Hussein, right? Even Islamic fundamentalists didn't like Saddam Hussein because he was a secularist and a Stalinist. But yes, some people do, of course. But it's not even about that. Even if Saddam Hussein is a terrible person, what gives anybody the right to come and remove them, especially when that country, for all its resources, for all its influence, for all its power, can't even, as it proved 2 years prior, couldn't even protect its own citizens, right? So that's why I have this very strong orientation about no one has any moral authority over anybody else. And usually the people who claim moral authority, who claim moral obligation, are doing so to mask their own, you know what I mean?
They're basing it on their own morals.
On their own morals and often on their own immorality, right? Like, it's often the person, the group of people who, again, like, we're the civilized ones. We swear we're the civilized ones. I mean, who did what to whom, right? It's Western Europe. It's a few Western European powers and the elites in Western Europe who, for hundreds of years, there's not one inhabitable continent in the world. And this is worth talking about when we talk about history, because people take this for granted. There's not one inhabitable continent that did not endure in slavery, genocide, or colonialism. When you think about it, not one, right? It was everywhere they went. And I mentioned this on the air when we first started, but it's worth meditating about this, because these people are gone. They're gone, and they can't speak for themselves now. They're almost all gone. But the majority of the landmass of the world, the indigenous inhabitants of the majority of the landmass of the world, are basically wiped out in the last few hundred years. Very, very recently. It's a massive historical crime, unlike anything else, unlike what we've done to the environment, unlike, I hate comparing victimhood, but unlike slavery, I would say, which has been around forever. Yeah. But like the fact that North America, South America, the Caribbean, and Australia, that's the majority of the landmass of the world, or about the 50%, let's say, of the landmass of the world, has had its indigenous, and there's also parts of the rest of the world that it had, including in Africa where there were genocides. King Leopold, the Belgians, 10 million Africans, and so on, the Herero people, etc. So in the last 300, the majority of the landmass of the world, essentially, has had its indigenous inhabitants killed off, or such large scale ethnic cleansing and genocide that there are very few people remaining, and they're basically about to disappear or be absorbed into other populations.
Okay.
That's worth thinking about when people talk about moral obligation and civilizing mission, because that's what that sense of I'm here to help the native, I'm here to help the savage, I'm civilizationally superior. That's how dangerous it can be.
Yeah. I want to start from the concept of objectivity. So, in order to remain completely objective to a particular thing, you have to exist in a state of non-beingness. And what I say by non-beingness means that you're nothing, basically. So you come from a place of nothing. You have no, you have no attachments to any side,
Gotcha, yeah.
So, like, and that's very difficult to do. Like, one of the things in law that, like, I've faced is when, like, as a judge, you're supposed to remain completely objective towards, like, the two opponents in front of you.
Right.
And then you have certain laws that are put down for you. So as long as you're purely objective and you are basically like the instrument of that law. So it's hard for people to be completely objective. That's true. But I think that the reason why one community feels like they have to involve themselves into another one is the international laws that we all agreed on. I mean, I have certain problems with that because there are certain countries that have veto power, and the only reason they have veto power are because they're the, like, the ones who started the whole thing and stuff.
United States, Russia, China,
yeah,
England and France, yeah.
Yeah, and your economical growth is what defines how much power you have, when reality money does not define happiness, and money does not mean you are the greatest power.
And not just power, but moral obligation, moral superior, civilizational superior. Like these 5 countries, okay, they have money, okay, they have power, great, that's fine. Well, because we have money and we have power, we are also the ones who can be the moral arbiters of the world. I don't see the connection.
Yeah,
Great.
And also, like, Americans are meant to live as Americans with the environment that they have, with the community that they have, with what they've built around them. That's their environment. You cannot expect Ethiopia to exist like America. You cannot expect China to exist like Ethiopia, or Ethiopia to exist like China.
I completely agree.
Different types of people, different types of environment, different types of ancestors, different types of influence. So there's a lot that goes into that. And it comes back to that noticing your separation and your unity. Which places are you actually united? Those moral obligations that you're basing your, judgment on, do they come from a truly, do they come from just your background or the things you're attached with, or do they come from like a purely objective state of mind? Did I make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense. That makes absolute sense.
Yeah, it's really difficult to make a judgment on what is meant to happen, but I think a larger part of the community agrees on certain rules and regulations to go by, and then that becomes objectivity.
Right.
As long as those rules and regulations have been met, it doesn't matter who has gone against the rules, that person is judged.
So objectivity is determined by the majority.
See,
you understand the problems, but this is also the criticism of democracy. Everybody's like, democracy. What is democracy? Majority rule? Because that means that 49% could potentially deal with the tyranny of the majority, right? And you see this with minority groups. Exactly. Well, okay, so there's another layer.
Back to minority rights. It's like, it's not just majority rule, minority rights. Like, the majority rule's okay, but the minorities exist and they have to be able to have a right to exist as themselves. That is a right.
Agreed.
Right? And just because the majority is the ruling party, and you're not going to go against the majority because, there's a certain type of attack you'll fear. And being a minority, there are certain situations that you find yourself in. Situations sometimes that are better than the majority, or, less advantageous than the majority.
Yeah.
Whatever that is. So, I guess it's all based on like the environment, the community, and what it is that's coming out of that discussion. I think the term democracy has been so overused that we have completely. I don't think we really understand what it means
We just know that it's the right thing. It's the right thing, and then we can define it however we want. Yeah.
Because why is it right? Actually, like let me come back to like Ethiopia was a country of kings and queens. Now we have a president. We believe it's right because Americans strive that way. Is it right for us?
And also, democracy in the Greek sense, the demos, right, the people rule. In Athens, there was no representation. Like everybody, it was a small enough community that everybody would stand up. I don't know how they did this without microphones, but everybody would stand up and offer their view and their voice. Nobody had. So once you have representational democracy, you elect people. It's not really democracy. It's more the idea of representative republic, right? It's not direct democracy. Okay, so already you have one layer. And then you have the fact that some of these democracies are bought off by moneyed interests, like the United States is. Then you have the fact that the United States, in my view, is not a democracy when it comes to presidential elections because it has electoral college and disproportionate apportionment of power. Then you have the fact that entire groups of people are still kept off the rolls or are still undereducated or kept out of. There's all kinds of voter suppression that one party uses to. Then you have to look at the fact that the history matters. The history of the country up until about 50, 60 years ago, certain groups of people couldn't vote, essentially, and up until 100 years ago, women couldn't vote. To this day, children can't vote, and and there are reasons that children can't vote, of course, but children can't vote, and they're more vested than anybody else in the future in the decisions that are made now. But they're not smart enough, so we have an arbitrary line. And in the United States, you're 18 years old is when you can vote, but then until you're 21, you can't drink, and there's all this arbitrariness. So people, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with democracy. I'm saying let's not proceed from the assumption that this is a simple thing that everybody should just accept. Like you said, there are other countries that have other political systems. The assumption we're just brainwashed with this is the right way to go.
Yeah, and also sometimes when you talk about a dictator, it has a very bad rep, right?
Right.
Like when you say dictator, the first thing that comes to mind is like this guy is killing his citizens, or it's military power, so like nobody's protected and stuff like that. How do you really know? Maybe that person you're calling a dictator is an individual ruler that's like really good to its community.
Right, the benevolent dictator.
Exactly.
Right.
And the only problem is he's not in a democracy and there are no other people helping him make that decision.
Or that he wasn't elected. Is that what it means? Because if you have 100% power, but you were elected to that, are you a dictator or are you a Democrat? You're not sharing power, but you were elected through power. And also, if you're elected once, how long do the term limits have to be?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think we've dipped into politics.
Right. No, but see, these are similar kind of questions about. We're not talking about specifically Ethiopian politics, right? That's what we kind of steer away from. But
specifics.
Yeah.
Yes.
But these are the questions about the assumptions. I think we grew out of this from the assumptions based on obligation, or that some civilization is right, versus the idea of moral authority and moral obligation. Right, because this all grows from a conversation we're having about self and other. Right, this is, but of course, this informs. Politics is just the way we solve problems. Politics is just the way the community, whether it's the immediate community, as in what the Panthers are talking about, or the national community, or the community of nations, right, the broader global community, how we organize ourselves, and how we try to create social order, which I think most people, except for anarchists, believe is necessary. But all of these questions grow out of, in a sense, this discussion on politics grows out of the relationship between self and other, between individual community. It's not too different from the thought experiment of, do I get to cut down that tree? And also, furthermore, should I be okay if I decide it's not right for me to cut down that tree? Is it okay for me to be neutral and to not intervene when somebody else comes and cuts down that tree? Right? It's the same conversation, just on a larger scale.
A different level. That brought something into mind, is like the concept of leadership itself. Is a leader supposed to be the type of person who only lives for their community? Or is a leader supposed to be the type of person who lives for their purpose, or themselves, or what they're trying to fulfill into the world? Yeah. So as a leader, what is expected of you? Certain people only accept you as a leader if you have certain specific, traits.
Yeah.
Your charisma, your ability to help people, and there are different things. That
Usually a
come
man.
into- yeah?
Usually a man. mean,
Well,
it's a new
depending on the
concept,
community,
yeah.
again, like depending on the community, because I think there's a Scandinavian country that's ruled by all women. Am I wrong about this?
I think we have one Scandinavian, and then also randomly like Rwanda, I think has majority, women in their parliament specifically.
Okay.
But in the grand scheme of things, yes, I mean, men, if not always the parliaments or I mean, in the United States, I think it's 20% representation for women, and that's that's much higher than it was for a very long time. So yeah, I mean, there is this idea of the patriarch, a male figure. And there are other, but you were saying there are other limitations we impose on women.
Why I raised this question is because I want to keep it a question. I want our audience to really think about this themselves. So I've had a teacher in my life that told me once that politics means the science of leadership or the science of ruling people.
Right, symbols of power kind of thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So politics is the science of ruling people. Politics is the science of taking care of people. Technically, that's where it came from.
Right.
And I've also had a friend that told me that politics is the politics, ticks,
Because everybody hates on politics.
Yes.
Everybody hates on politics. It's a dirty word.
Okay, so it's not a dirty word. It's a dirty game. The game has become dirty. It's not really the politics itself, the science itself.
Right.
It's the inability to be compassionate towards another person and actually take your personal ideals out of it and actually think about the community as a whole. And then when we say this, we also have to consider collateral damage, which happens to be the minority in any system, right?
Yeah.
All right. So, there's a lot of things to say about this. So let's come back to the concept of self and other. So what is it for you? I really want to know what it's like for you. Where do you come from? Do you believe in the purpose that you have for this world? Or do you believe in, living for other people?
I believe that there, as I said before, that there is no such thing as moral absolute or moral authority. There's a great film about this. I've told you I wanted to show you this film called Half Nelson from 2006. It's this not very well-known director. He didn't do much else. It was his first film, named Ryan Fleck, an independent director. And it's about a white guy played by Ryan Gosling. Incredible performance. He goes into this school, and he's teaching these black kids about dialectics, about what I was talking about before. And he does so, but he gets engaged in a kind of a dialectic as a white man with this black guy because he's also secretly, even though he's a cool guy and a really good teacher, you could tell, very performative, he also is secretly a drug addict. Oh. And one of his students discovers that he's a drug addict.
Okay.
And he gets involved into a feud. We were talking about antagonists. There's always a power dynamic. He gets involved in a feud with a character played by Anthony Mackie, who's like a community leader and a cool guy and a nice guy, but he's also a drug dealer. and he knows the girl because her brother is in jail because of him. He was running drugs for him.
Okay.
And so they both see the other take her in or develop a relationship with her. Mm-hmm. And they both try to protect the girl from the other. But the white guy who comes into the classroom and is Mr. Anthony Mackie says to him, so we're back to what's white is right. When Mr. A1 model citizen, he knows that the guy's a drug user because he used to serve him, right? And at the same time, Anthony Mackie is a bit of a snake charmer himself. He doesn't have any right to tell the girl he's going to protect her from a basehead because he's a so this is a very complicated kind of historical process, right? Mm-hmm. But they're both also dealing with self and other, which is to say the Gosling character can't take care of himself. He's an overgrown man-child. He's depressed. He's a drug addict. His life is failing. His girlfriend, he says, almost in tears, is about to get married to another man. But he's also an excellent teacher. Can't take that away from him. And he means well, and he's very conscious of his limitations. Mm-hmm. When Mackie calls him out and says, well, it's white is right, he's like, oh, man, he got me, right? I can't be the white guy who comes in and tells people, because I have institutional power and I have the right skin color, right, how to be. But, so he has that thing so he just says to him, I don't know. I don't know. And a lot of the film is people just being like, I don't know, I'm trying to figure it out myself. It's all these problems and no simple answers. And I love that film because it leaves you, it's very open-ended in that way. And it leaves you with a lot of questions because in that relationship between self and other, you want to look at, especially he's older than her, he's her teacher. He knows this guy is if you just look at it from Gosling's perspective, but also from Mackie's perspective, they're trying to protect the girl from the other guy. Okay. And they have an obligation, right? They got to do something, but also I have no authority here, right? Like, who am I to tell anybody, Okay. So I use that film as a metaphor, right? Because that's really what I believe, is that there's no moral absolutes, that there may be an objective reality, but it's always filtered through subjective perception. All relationships between individuals are really just people projecting themselves out onto the other person and their energy onto the other person. There is a need for politics. There is a need for community, but there's also a need for awareness of that nobody has any real moral authority over anybody else. And so that's basically what I believe, is that you could try to help somebody else, but be careful, because nobody's perfect, as you said before. Nobody's perfect. Everybody's flawed, and so I guess that's the relationship between the whole question of self and other, and community and history and politics and so on. These are all interrelated issues. Just like that film is about the education system, it's about the prison system, because Sharika Epps, the young girl character, her brother is in jail. It's about drug addiction. It's about race relations, and it's also about gender or sexual. Because he's an older guy, she's a young girl. It's like, is this an appropriate relationship? They're like friends, But these are all, and it's really about history. Because the film is interspersed with these oral presentations that the kids give about all these episodes from American history. And so history doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not some boring textbook or whatever. This is the constant daily, this is how history plays out in these simple interactions between a black guy and a white guy and this young black girl. So I definitely recommend that film. But if I'm using that film as a metaphor, because I've thought about it a lot, that, like, to answer your question, I don't think anybody has an obligation. And I think we have to be very careful about the idea of obligation. I believe in the principle of neutrality. It is good to help other people. I'm not saying otherwise. But it starts to get dangerous to feel obligated to, or to feel guilty, what we were talking about before, about people, when guilt starts feeding denial and it gets perverted against, and now you have a reason to feel guilty, right? Because now you've contributed to a problem. And I don't believe in moral absolutes. But I do think we're all trying. We're all trying to help ourselves. We're all trying to help one another. And as long as you're trying, as you said, we're imperfect. We're along that path. As long as you're trying and your intentions are good, and you don't start thinking that you're perfect and that you have any moral authority over somebody else, nobody can really blame you.
Technically, I feel that what truly defines your leadership and your ability to lead is the community you've created through your followers. What are your followers like? What is that community like? What is that country like? What is, what's your... If you're the leader in a certain concept, what is it that, like, what is the purpose of that particular community? And if you're living purely for the community, you allow your community to lead the way. And if you're living particularly from your own purpose, you allow your community to live your purpose, right?
Right.
So I think it's for everybody to decide. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Okay. So it's for everybody to decide where they want to come from. There are people who do not want to be leaders, and somehow they end up leading.
Yeah.
Because they attract so many followers, because they give people comfort to be fully themselves.
Right.
Because they are so empty from any identification of who they are, they allow that other person's, reality to exist. And that's incredibly comforting for some people. Like, imagine talking to a mirror. That person has no actual... There's this lady on YouTube, maybe you could search, I think I forgot her name, but she sits down and eye gazes with different types of people for long hours, silently. She never says anything, she doesn't react, she's just basically eye gazing. And there's nothing. There's literally the only thing you see is the fact that she's a human being, and then a woman dressed in all white is sitting on a chair.
Yeah.
But besides that, while you're doing the eye gazing, you start to reflect upon yourself.
Yeah.
So there's a certain amount of following for that type of person. And then there's the following that comes with Obama, for example. Obama had a purpose. That purpose was he attracted a lot of followers based on that purpose. And anyone in politics is like that too. There's a purpose that they're looking for. There's something that they say they will do for the country. And the reason that people follow them is because that purpose aligns with their own purposes in life.
Right.
So it's like a co-creation sometimes, and sometimes it's just the community projecting itself and actually healing itself through one person. Using that person as a portal to kind of find your unity or kind of find the common ground between the two of you.
The story of Echo and Narcissus is an interesting metaphor for self and other, and for suffering that resulted. I read it as suffering that results from being too rooted in the self, versus suffering that results basically narcissistic personality disorder, narcissist, right? Who's completely immersed in his own reflection. But I always used to wonder when I was a kid, why don't Narcissus and Echo have their own stories? The story is Echo and Narcissus. Well, Narcissus is a story.
It's the duality playing its
right.
Yeah.
The duality is the extreme, because the one is gazing at his own reflection, and so he's trapped and isn't living. Right? It's narcissistic disorder. And then the other, and I think there are elements of both of these in everyone, especially artists. Artists tend to have either narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. My understanding of Echo is that that's borderline personality disorder, where you exist as an echo of another person. You don't have your own personality. You're afraid to form it. So one is being too rooted in the self, to the point of obsessive and also to the point of paralysis. I mean, narcissist is not living. Versus Echo, which is not living because you are not rooted in the self and are constantly, like you said, a mirror, looking to mirror, reflect in the other. So that might be a good place to put an end to this. Do you think, or do you want to keep going?
Yeah, I wanted to like kind of have that story, so like the audience can kind of reflect on that, like the story of Echo and Narcissus. I know about the story of Narcissus. He died staring at himself in the reflection of water. Right? I'm not very sure about the story of Echo. Could you please?
Right. Echo is because sometimes myth is there too. It's a metaphor. Sometimes it's meant to mobilize people, like political myths and so on. And then sometimes it's a story of human experience that also claims to, on the surface, explain some natural phenomena. So why is it that when you speak into a cave, there's an echo? Right? That's literally what Echo is. So Echo is also a mythological character, or a character, I guess this would be legend versus myth, I'm not sure. But in this story, right?
It's Greek mythology, right?
Greek mythology, I believe. So I get confused sometimes. What is legend? What is myth? Etc. But I believe, so myth is trying to explain truths. So this would be, it's trying to explain, on the surface level, why is it that when I speak into a cave I hear myself echo? Oh, there's a woman in there named Echo, who's just repeating my words. But then the deeper psychological truth, this is the beauty of this kind of stuff, right? Is that it operates on so many levels, or at least on two. The deeper psychological analysis of that is that there are people out there who have no sense of self. And they just echo. A lot of creative types are either one of these or both. Okay. So, I mean, everybody knows that. Both at the
same time?
Yeah, and everybody knows that narcissism, and a lot of that narcissism often has to do with relationships with parents and childhood trauma and not having felt protected, or, having been neglected or something like that. And people, as a result, feel the need to coddle themselves and to protect themselves and become completely absorbed in their own suffering, right? And that's what happens essentially to narcissists. With Echo, it's that they don't ever address themselves because so for instance, a lot of I think I can't be sure about this, but a lot of voice actors, a lot of people who are good with accents, a lot of good people, a lot of actors in particular, or a lot of people who do those kinds of performative arts where they're constantly embodying others and they're able to do different voices, different accents. They're able to people who have very good tonal hearing, like and therefore are very good singers. A lot of people like that are not really rooted in themselves. They're so attuned to picking up on other people's personalities or other people's ways of talking or other people, you know what I mean? That they're constantly trying to embody somebody else. Their echo.
Or a character.
Right.
So, but like I would disagree when it comes to like people with, people who mimic voice, that I would say is echo. But there are people that have incredible hearing perception that find this really unique type of voice, like Mariah Carey. Unlike Ariana Grande can do a very close Mariah Carey, but we can all agree that she's not Mariah.
Yeah, Mariah Carey.
You know what I
people
mean?
who don't know who are too young, Mariah Carey is one of the greatest vocalists I've ever.
Oh my God, she has an incredible voice. I remember watching a movie called Glamour.
Yeah.
I just immediately fell in love with her voice. It was incredible. And I have had a lot of people tell me that like Ariana Grande sounds like her, but like Ariana Grande sounds like Ariana Grande.
So you're saying Ariana Grande is the echo?
Sort of.
Yeah.
I mean,
The
I'm not saying
imitator.
she is an echo, but like Ariana Grande has her own way, like, you know, her own voice. No matter how much she tries to echo Mariah Carey, she's not. And you can see that. And you can admit that fact. She can hit the same pitch, but she doesn't deliver it the same way. Does that?
No, I
so
get
it's like
exactly.
even when you're echoing someone else, there is that underlying personality that you have, that uniqueness that you cannot deny.
Right. I mean, I think I know what you mean when you take exception, because people who do impersonations, there are a few who are really great at it. If anybody's interested, Frank Caliendo, who was on Mad TV before, who can do like 8 different perfect spot-on voices within one conversation and make you feel like you're sitting there with 8 different people.
Exactly. And there's this guy who does a really good Talahun Gassese.
Yeah.
Right? Young Talahun, they call him, or like Tanishu Talahun.
But I don't know Frank Caliendo's early years, but there was a guy named Daryl Hammond on Saturday Night Live who did George W. Bush for many years, or he did Al Gore for many years, and he refused to do John McCain.
Why is that?
Because John McCain had been tortured, and so had Daryl Hammond when he was a child. His mother had tortured him. She used to cut his tongue or whatever. He had a psychotic. Wow. So I think, putting these two together, because I've heard Daryl Hammond talk about the traumas of his childhood, this has something to do with, you know what I mean, his so I'm not in a position to diagnose anybody, but I sense that there's some aspect of borderline personality, or there's some aspect of echo. Now, there are people who are really good at this, but generally speaking, you don't hear too many people talk about the greatest impersonators in the world, right? What they talk about is the greatest actors, and when actors, you know, are supposed to do, like when Will Smith did Muhammad Ali, or when Jamie Foxx did Ray, he had to do the voice pretty well to make it believable. But one thing they tell you when you're acting is don't try to do an impersonation of that person just because you're performing as a historical figure that everybody knows. You have to get to the essence of that person, right? You have to draw on yourself on that person. You're not just doing echo, right? Because then it's just an impersonation, or it's just indicating, or it's just, you know what I mean? It's just like picking up on little.
You can't really hit the nail on the head.
Right, because you're not really empathizing with that character. You're not really embodying them. You're just kind of doing superficial, like echo, like mimicking somebody. You know what I mean? So that's something I picked up, like learning about acting, right? But again, that's that whole relationship between self and other, right? It's one thing to have a connection with somebody based on empathy, like a real, really trying to connect with somebody else, which might be the most amazing thing that a human being can achieve. Because no matter what we do, and human beings are capable of all kinds of things, as individuals, the one thing we can never do is be somebody other than ourselves. We're always stuck with ourselves. But the idea that you can get close to knowing what it's like to be somebody else, that's what acting is an exercise in empathy. But there's a clear difference between that exercise in embodying somebody else, or empathizing with somebody else, and mimicking their superficial ways of speaking, you know what I mean? Which is not, you know what I mean? But that's a fine line.
I see where you're coming from. It brings me to, one word comes to mind, integration. So you basically have to integrate self and other. It's like you exist as yourself, yes, and also other people exist. And you constantly have to acknowledge the fact that who you are exists, unless you are an extremist who believes that, you know, like, I am nothing. And it works. For certain people it works. But it's usually an integration. No one exists in one extreme or the other. So, like, you have to find that fine line, or that, like, spot, that, like, right spot where it's good for you and good for you, the other, whatever you call other.
It's funny when you say that, because I've experienced this in my own life, and I think a lot of people experience feeling sometimes that they might be slightly schizophrenic, or that they might have slightly different personalities. I mean, we all kind of play different personalities in different situations, but would you say this concept of integration, which I'm learning something new. I had not heard of this idea of integrating self and other. Would you say sometimes you have to integrate different aspects of your own personality into one? Right?
Yes,
because some of us become one person in one situation. We forget that we have other tendencies. Right? Like when we go down our suffering, or when we go down our weak paths, we forget that, there's no reason for this. I have all these other strengths and all these other, expressed in all these different ways. But then when we go down in the strengths, we have to remember, but I also have my weaknesses. You know what I mean? Like integrating different aspects of your own personality, right?
Exactly. I know, and there's the spiritual teacher called Teal Swan. She has a video on YouTube that says, forgive the French, but fuck balance.
That's good. We can curse once in a while.
Yeah, she says, fuck balance. Let's go for integration this time. Because, like, balance is always constantly makes you, like, what's my weakness? What's my strength? You're constantly on this scale. Yeah. But when you integrate and combine those things, you not only admit that you have bad sides and good sides, you admit the fact that you can transmute your good sides into bad things. You have that capacity, and you can transmute your bad sides into good things. Right. You can use your bad characters to help people, and your good characters can hurt people. Right. Honesty is the best policy. Everybody likes to say this. Honesty is the best policy. Honesty is the best policy. But when you use honesty to hurt people, it's not really the best policy. You have to recognize who is the politician in this situation, right? That truth or that honest truth spoken in a situation where it's causing other people detriment, then I do not think it is actually the best policy. Sometimes silence is the best policy, right? And there are truths that don't really help anyone. They're just damaging. Right? Yeah. And then there also, lies are horrible. Of course, you're not supposed to lie to a person. But there are certain things maybe it's not your place to tell them. You can't convince a person that he's wrong. He has to see it for himself. Right. If you keep constantly telling them about that truth that's true for you and is a lie to them, then you're a liar, right? That's your truth. You can't enforce that reality on a person. Even though you're being honest to them, it's a lie. So it's like the way you see things. But when you integrate it, you understand the fact that, both sides do actually exist. And what is it in this aspect that is supporting or... what is it called? Supporting or helpful to the other side, Yeah. How we combine the yin and yang, basically. Yeah. Like, put yourself in that yin and yang. Yeah. And see how those two things can, support each other instead of be of detriment to each other. Right. Your weaknesses could be actual strengths.
This goes back to This goes back to, what did you call it? Polarity, right? Mm-hmm. But this goes back to what Marxists call dialectics, right? The idea of over and over again, there's this two-ness, Capulets and the Montagues, right? We tend to divide everything into two. Even our bodies. Our bodies are very strange in that way. We're entirely symmetrical. You have two of everything, right? That are basically, divided along. And you're constantly trying to balance things out, right? So the fact that this keeps expressing itself, like there are these opposites or these poles, or the possibility that you become out of balance by shifting in one direction or another, and you constantly have to balance it out. But I also, have started to really believe myself in the concept of the core at the core of the human being, right? Like, and I don't have the extensive background in meditation or in spiritual practices that you have. Which I appreciate you coming on and contributing. But to me, I realize so often, as long as you stay centered, as long as you stay in your core, you're not going to say the wrong thing. You're not going to make the wrong choice. You're going to remain confident. You're not going to suffer. I mean, in general, right?
You, yeah. But sometimes saying certain things even though their truth could be detrimental to other people because it goes against their own personal egos or their personal beliefs.
Right. I didn't mean
Right?
to speak about truth.
Okay.
I mean,
Staying
you can
centered.
lie while be centered, and you can tell the truth. Often, you blurt out the truth when you're off center, right? But I guess what I'm saying is like underneath us, the core, the whatever. I don't understand the language of chakras and all that stuff. I've heard it. I don't really get it, right? But you have a center. There's something that centers you, and every time you get off that center, and you make a decision or you take an action or you speak to someone, that's usually when you mess up because you're off center.
Yeah. You're
Whenever
on
you
one
stay
side or the
centered,
other.
yeah, whenever you stay centered, and there are a lot of reasons to be blown off center. That's why we're human. That's why we all make mistakes. But almost always, like if you're in that mental or emotional or physical state, these are all interrelated, as you pointed out earlier, right? Of being off center or off kilter. You know what I mean? Or being you just that's when you make the mistake, or that's when you screw up, or that's when you overreact or react negatively or whatever. And as long as you stay centered, you know what I mean? Things are going to happen in the external world. You can't control it, but it doesn't really make much of a difference.
You don't suffer as much. Basically.
You don't suffer as much, and I think that's what I learned from reading Taoism. You know Taoism?
Yes.
Much?
Yeah.
I mean Taoism is really predicated on the concept that you have no effect on what happens out beyond you, because the passage of time, the transience of everything, the vastness of time and space, make it such that you know the old story about the man with the cow in China, right? You know that story, the peasant with the cow in China. So there's so I'll tell you quick. I mean, I've heard it in college. I've heard it in movies. I've heard it being spoofed in movies. You know, because it's a very powerful story that people retain, right? And it tells a really important lesson. Very simple story. A man in China, and he has a cow. I think I've even told this story on the air. A man in China, and he has a cow. The cow runs off one day. And all the people in the village say, you know this story. Okay.
A good thing or a bad thing.
Yes, right. And
And
they go, well, that's too bad. And he goes, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Then one day, just to wrap up the story, because it's a short one, right? But you recognize it. Then one day the cow brings back a mate, an ox or whatever. And everybody in the village is like, oh, it was good that he ran off because now you have milk and meat for generations. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Then one day his son is riding the bull or the ox or whatever. He falls off and he gets injured from the neck down, paralyzed. Everybody's like, oh, it was terrible. I don't know if it was a good thing or a bad thing. Right? And then finally barbarian hordes come and invade the village. They kill every able-bodied man and young men, but his son survives that massacre. And they're like, well, it was good that the cow ran off because he brought down the ox, and then he fell off, and that's why he survived the massacre. And the peasant says, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. So the fact that we get so stressed out about wanting something, you know, Buddhism, they say suffering is either about wanting, it's about craving, or it's about aversion. I want, or I don't want. I want this, or I don't want this to happen. We get so tied up in our happiness occurring with one thing. Maybe if one day if you get the job that you always want, and maybe you're driving to that job, and this is an extreme example, you get hit by a truck and you die. Whereas if you hadn't gotten that job, or better likely, and how many of us can experience this in our career, if you had you missed out on a job, but then whoops, a better job came along the next, and all that stress that you had about missing out on the job, you really internalize this story about the man in China. You understand that Taoism is like, you know, Winnie the Pooh is a Taoist story. You know Winnie the Pooh? Or, you know, there's a whole book called The Tao and Pooh, where he sits and eats honey and he kind of relaxes, and all of his friends are like, hey, let's go out and move Pooh, and he's like, no, I'm just chilling. I'll be with the trees. I'll be with the environment. They call this the 10,000 things. The vastness of time and space makes us so Lilliputian in contrast that there is nothing we can do to affect our I mean, we can affect it, but it's going to be transient. It's going to go away anyway. That there's no way for us to know ahead of time. We don't even know looking backward. We can't even isolate an event looking backward and say, this happened and therefore this happened and therefore that happened. We can't. Let alone anticipate it ahead of time and say whether something is a good thing or a bad thing. We can't even always assess what happened in the past because everything is so linear, we don't know what would have been affected by it, let alone anticipate into the future. So when you really consider that, the stress that goes into daily human life, and I want this and I don't want that, is completely bananas. It doesn't make any sense, right? And that's very liberating. It's scary. The 10,000 things, the vastness and the helplessness of human beings is scary. We like to think we have control over our situation.
But it's also kind of liberating.
It's liberating. Exactly.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's liberating.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned about like we exist in two things, we have two eyes, two breathing, it was like two lips, two teeth, But at the end of the day, like they combine to create one organ, right? There's the breathing, and then they combine to create a system, and they combine to create you, the individual you. So like you have to know that even if one part of you did not exist, you would be a little less like the person you were before. Let's go to there are people that have faced fundamental difference in their lives because they lost a certain person in their lives, or they lost a certain body part. We become so different, right? And there's a change that comes with that, but it doesn't necessarily mean it completely eradicates who you are, but that change is still caused, right? And that whole you that you have is still whole. Do you know what I mean? It's still whole, but it's a different type of you.
It's evolved.
In a different way, and that's neither a good thing or a bad thing, or it is a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it.
Because it is so interesting. I mean, on the one hand, we are, especially in our suffering, we and in our personalities and behavior, we're replicating our childhood, right? We often are replicating our relationships with family members and with other people in the community, and how our formative years, how we were formed. But at the same time, they say our physical constitution has changed. If you're like me and you're in your mid-30s, it's probably changed 3 or 4 times entirely. The cells of my body have completely cycled through 3 or 4 times since all those things that happened to me when I was a child. So on the one hand, I am not only a different person, I've gone through 3 or 4 different iterations of being, physical iterations of being in terms of the cycle of the cells. And on the other hand, I have the same DNA composition that I will always have, the same architecture, the same blueprint. And I also have the same environmental blueprint, which is the formative years of childhood. So it's funny. Like, are we evolving in a different direction completely, or or maybe this is another one of those dialectics, right? Where as you evolve, but you stay the same all the while. The
both
more I think about it,
happen at the same time.
Right? The more I think about it, this dialectic thing or polarity or whatever tends to that everything is what it is, and also its opposite at the same time, right? And it's held together in this bizarre tension. This is why they say the test of a great mind is the ability to hold 2 opposite thoughts at the same time. Right? That's what they always say. The test of a great mind is you have 2 completely opposite thoughts and you're thinking them at the same time.
So is that would you call that objective? Right?
No.
You can argue for both concepts and still hold them true in your mind?
No, I wouldn't say that's objective. I think there's no way for an individual to be objective. Period.
Ooh, I disagree with that. Yeah. My whole
permanently. I mean, maybe at times, maybe you have moments of ego death. Maybe you have moments of empathy. But everything there, I'm not saying there is no objective reality. I'm saying that objective reality is external, and all experience of that objective reality is filtered through subjective perception.
I see.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. As long as you are a subjective person, a unique being, as long as you identify yourself as something, then you can't be purely objective. Unless there are rules and regulations that guide your objectivity. But whose rules and regulations are those?
Right, exactly.
Right?
Where's the moral authority?
Yeah.
Where's the moral authority? They're all subjective
too.
Moral
authority,
right. And at the same time, I don't go as far as postmodernists. postmodernists and deconstructivists and all this post-structuralist, postmodernists, which are post-colonialists, all the post stuff that started happening in the 60s and 70s that took over the liberal arts, that I think is part of what's destroying the liberal arts, because they accepted positionality. They accepted that everybody, so the cliche is, I was in Holland for a while, and I was listening to people describe their dissertations for all these, anthropologists, cultural studies, all these people, and they'll be like, I'm joking when I say this. This is an exaggeration, but this is basically how I understood what was. I'm giving an exaggerated example that's not real. But let's say I'm a lower middle class Brazilian lesbian woman that grew up in the 1980s, and I'm going to write about fossils, but my approach is the lower middle class lesbian female Brazilian woman who grew up in the 80s perspective on fossils.
What?
In other words,
how?
Fossils,
everything, right?
Right. I'm giving an exaggerated example,
I know,
but basically, like, you can study anything, but really, what you're studying is yourself, and what you break down in yourself is your perspective, your positionality, your position in this world that is broken almost always down into identity. Identity, as if we are not more than. These identification marks. I think I am more than. Yes, I'm a black man. Yes, I grew up in Ethiopia or in America and Senegal. Yes, I'm Ethiopian. Yes, I'm this. Yes, I'm heterosexual. Yes, I'm this. I'm that. But I'm also much more than that, right? And I don't appreciate that. The other problem is this reduces the ivory tower, the academia to the ivory tower, to irrelevance, because it sounds like an egomaniacal or narcissistic kind of practice, where what you're really doing is talking about, you're studying everything as if studying yourself, and it's true that everything is subjective. All perception is subjective. It's true that there is no real moral authority, and there is no one theory that explains everything. I accept that, and that everybody has their narrative, everybody has their perspective, and there's no objective, or we can never know objective reality, even if it exists. There's no way to perceive it objectively. However, these are limitations that our selfishness or ourselves impose on us. Those are not, we shouldn't be feeding into that. Right? We should be trying to overcome those limitations. Right? But that's what postmodernism does, is it becomes an exercise in first of all, everything is interpretation. And very little knowledge is produced as a result. Everything is about taking knowledge and filtering it through your subjective interpretation and presenting it as, this is my subjective, which is fine on some level, but on another level it's like, but yes, we should accept our subjectivity, but as an obstacle, right, that we have to overcome to come to a clearer understanding of objective reality. Does that make sense? It's almost like we're feeding into the very problem by accepting it.
Well, subjectivity and objectivity, I think, is also like one form of polarity, right? Like, if we're integrating those two concepts, what would it look like? Because a researcher will research a particular subject based on, his own understanding and his own background knowledge. He'll find particular parts of the research interesting based on his own mental state. But then if there are 2 and 3 people doing that research at the same time, you might read different types of research, right? All
exactly,
3 people did 3 different types of research. You'll read different things and learn more about that particular thing than you would from just one person. Unless that person was purely objective, and
which doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's highly unlikely. But like maybe 2-3 people work on a particular project, right?
Right.
2-3 people share their ideas, share their ideologies, and create this one big research project, and that project has to cater to different types of community. I think this is what democracy technically is right now, right? Like, we create this file, this law, this code, or this paper that is supposed to align all of our, interests in life and whatnot. So, yeah, that's what I think. But, like, I'd still say, like, come back to integration. Find a way to integrate whatever it is into your world, and I found peace in it.
I completely agree. That's a great way to put it. It's about integration. You have to accept your objective, your subjectivity. You have to acknowledge, and it's good to acknowledge to your audience your limitations, or I come from this or that. I am a Marxist, or I'm a this, or I'm a that. This informs my, but I'm not going to make that a limitation.
Yes.
Right. I'm gonna have that inform, as many other things inform my perspective. The other thing I want to I'm really glad you incorporated that idea. I hadn't thought about that. And this is also self and other, right? Integrating self and other and the internal and the external.
Exactly.
It's a very complicated process. But the other thing about this is, just because everybody has a narrative, just because everybody has limitations, just because there's objective reality, doesn't mean all opinions are equal. Like you talked about, if I read 3 different researchers, and then I come together, it is possible that one of the, and this happens all the time when I studied history at the higher levels or whatever, and literature at the higher levels, right? I can read 3 novels about the same subject, and it's possible that one of those novels is written by a really good writer who did his research and did a really good job, and the other 2 are worthless. Right, so it's not even strength in numbers. So just because there's 2 against 1 doesn't mean they're twice as smart. Nor is it that, and this is the problem with democracy, and this is also the problem with postmodernism, is, well, everybody's equal. Everybody has equal. And listen, I'm not saying that people shouldn't have equal vote kind of participation. I'm saying that some people have argued that the best argument against democracy is a 10-minute conversation with the average voter, where you realize that they don't know what the hell they're talking about, right? And again, this doesn't mean that we should take away the right to vote for everybody. I'm not saying that. I understand the principle behind it, but now with social media, this is a real danger that's coming around. Just because you have somebody who's a professor in something that studied for 20 years, and some dude who's just typing away at his computer, social media has equalized everybody's opinion, and they have had there's a book called The Death of Expertise that came out some years ago, and that social media and other phenomena have contributed to this. And this is also what contributes to the whole concept of the post-truth moment, and everybody calling everybody else's facts fake news. And you know what I mean? This is what happens and nobody trusts authorities. And now the whole anti-vaxxer thing with coronavirus, now this is about life and death. Can we trust our authorities? Or is a healthy suspicion of authority important? Or is it going to cost millions of lives? You know what I mean? Like, I think one of the real dangers of the moment we're in, that was propelled by postmodernism and democratization and social media and all this, is now everybody is equal, but not everybody's opinion is equal on any specific matter, right?
Yeah, I'd like to say something else. We have equal rights, but technically we're equivalent, not equal. Like, when you say you're equal with, we are different. We are all different in our own ways. We've accepted that. We all have our own unique sides. There are unique countries. Ethiopia is unique. Kenya is unique. Somalia is unique.
Right.
Right. That uniqueness makes us equivalent. Right. Because we have equal rights. Our rights, a great way to put it, are what make us equal. And that equality is something that you could choose to give someone else, as long as you're willing to see them as a unified or another part of you, or as another expression of who you are.
Right. We are equal in value, not necessarily equal in merit. What I always think of is, two people could sit here, and men do this all the time. We do this anytime. One guy is smarter than the other. I mean, women compete too, but you know what I mean. 2 individuals will compete in the pettiest ways. I'm better than you because I'm smarter than you. When the other guy could be like, well, I'm better than you because I'm taller than you. Well, I'm better than you because I'm this. I'm better than you because... And you can go on and on and on. No 2 people are equal, because any 2 individuals, one of them is going to have a million things that they could potentially lord over the other, and vice versa, right?
Yeah.
So I like the way you put it, that we might not be all equal, but I guess we're equal in value, or we're equivalent, right? That nobody is better than anybody.
Yeah.
Right? I heard an older person say this to me once, when I was like, I don't like, we're talking about white people. I was like, I don't like the way they act. They act often, even the most liberal, friendly white person will often act with this attitude that they're just better than you. And he was like, nobody's better than anybody. What does that mean? Somebody's better than somebody else. And it was one of the most genuine expressions of a basic concept. But, underlying democracy, equality, justice, nobody's better than anybody. You might be everybody's better at something than everybody else. Nobody has equal competencies, but they have equivalence underlying that. The only thing I would add to problematize this a little bit is the concept of equivalence. When you say that something is equivalent, I've also heard the term false equivalence. right?
Right.
And maybe this is more like false equal, and we're just getting into a vocabulary thing, but false equivalence, a little bit like not everybody has the same level of knowledge, or not everybody's opinion is the same. What I was talking about before, the death of expertise. False equivalence is an interesting concept to me as well. False equivalence is, Democrats and Republicans, again, the polarities, right? The two forces, which are basically the same force and are really providing an illusion of choice. So they're essentially the same. But nowadays, at least in their rhetoric, they're completely different. In their approach, in their media, in the worlds they live in, they're talking about completely different things. Even if on policy, on substance, they're not that different. People have pointed this out on the Democratic side. It's like people keep making these false equivalents, right? And Edward R. Murrow character in the film about McCarthyism, Good Night and Good Luck. He says, I've thought about this. He goes, there aren't always two equal sides to every freaking story, right? Like sometimes some people are just objectively wrong, right? Or sometimes people are just saying something that is morally reprehensible, right? So I'm not doing away with objectivity entirely. Does that make sense? Right? Like there's still, even then when we try to create this balance, it was like, well listen, sometimes you have your own opinions, but you can't have your own facts, right? There is such a thing as a fact. There might not be a grand metaphysical truth, and that's what postmodernists always say. There is no truth. I agree. There's no truth, right? There's no enlightening, all-encompassing answer. But there are facts, right? Okay. There is an objective reality, even if it's filtered through our subjective perception.
So let's define equivalence to what does it mean to each of us, and then we can understand what we're trying to say about that equivalence. That for me, what I'm talking about is equal. When you say that you're equal, that means you are completely, the same in value. This concept of equality has a lot to do with the feminist movement. Women are equal. Right. I've always said this to everyone. I'm like, we're not. We're equivalent.
Right.
Women have their strengths.
We are the same in value, but we're not the same in anything else. Yeah.
And then that's what I come back to. Even in America, the Democrats and the Republicans, they're equivalent. Their ideas are definitely different, but their combination forms U.S. That unity, that organ, that big USA is...
Right, or at least the mainstream system, political system is
the two of them combined.
They can never...
And every other system that there is, I'm not very well versed on that, but every other system there is that creates the bigger USA.
Right. And you can't get rid of the other part. Democrats could not be a one single party system.
No.
Otherwise, the United States would cease to have
to be what it is,
and to have that illusion of democracy that it sells. Because then it'd be like, well, wait a second, everybody has to agree with the one political. So, oh no, there are two, but they're really mirror images, or they're very similar, right?
Yeah, and it's the arguments and the discussions between those two parties that has allowed America to evolve the way it has evolved. I feel because if that friction or that conversation did not happen, the integration or the middle ground where both parties can exist peacefully amongst each other would not have been a reality.
Right.
So, same thing for us. We have to believe that we're equivalent. There are a lot of, here in Ethiopia, there are a lot of ethnicities. And, we're equivalent. We're not equals. We have different values in life. We have different communities in life. In Addis Ababa, it's easier to,
Are we defining equal as the same? That what we mean by equal, right? Because
that's that's the idea it brings to mind.
Right.
For a lot of people, I've noticed when you say we're equal, they try to take it back to the same. I've had discussions with men plenty of times about men are strong, men have, different capacities, are physically strong, or they're doing this or that, and then a woman would say, no, a woman is mentally this way or that way, and when you make it okay, so the woman would argue back and say, I could be strong too, and then there's a woman bodybuilder, and yes, that is definitely possible.
Probably physically stronger than 95% of, but there's also, women are stronger than men physically in a sense. Because women have to endure. Endurance is strength. It's not just
enduring pain.
Enduring pain and enduring quite a bit of right. Men have more physical prowess, but strength is not always a matter of prowess. Sometimes strength is a matter of endurance. There's a reason women also live longer, in spite of or maybe because of all the pain built into a woman's physical experience of life, right? But we're straying. But I wanted to get back to the concept of equality, and the definitions of it, because this also relates back to politics in the sense that equality is for a lot of people a dirty word still. In the international liberal world order, the World Bank, IMF, the UN, you have to be very careful because equality sounds like you're a communist, right? Equality means, to people, is equality of outcome, right? And people will have to so people start using the term equity / equal opportunity, right? Equality of opportunity, right? So just because two people have children, okay, most people would agree that. Even communists, Mao Zedong at the end of his life was like, we call ourselves communists, but we all earn different wages. So at some point, and he realizes at the end of his life, it's like, at some point, some kind of class difference is going to reassert itself, right? When people are earning a different amount, right? So it comes down to money. But let's say not everybody has to earn the same income. Fine. Not everybody has to earn the same income. That doesn't mean that 1% of the world's population should own like 80% of the wealth as it does now, but okay. It doesn't have to be one extreme or the other. But let's say different people have different income. That doesn't mean that those people's children should have wildly different access to education, to healthcare, to social conditioning, because that's no longer a matter of whether or not to have equality of outcome. That's a matter of equality of opportunity. That's equality of what goes into the life of or the experience of an individual, not what comes out of it, right? So you understand what I'm saying? So there is this question of equality, equity. You use the word equivalence, which is a really nice way to put it. When we say equality, whichever term we use, this does not mean that everybody's the same, because as you pointed out, and we keep coming back to it, everybody's different, right? Everybody contains some universal qualities, universal human qualities, and experiences a lot of the same things that the person next to them, and that doesn't even necessarily realize it. Right? That's why the joke about the orange juice, or the observation about the orange juice and the toothpaste resonates with so many people who thought it was just me, right? Or any number of other. But everybody, it's like each individual personality expresses or manifests those similarities in very specific, individualized ways.
Yeah. And also, okay. I lost my train of thought.
No.
So, okay. So, what came to mind was, when you have to admit something that, one thing is a fact. We exist.
Right.
And there's another fact. We coexist.
I like that.
So,
okay.
Our existence matters just as much as our coexistence. Who you're coexisting with matters just as much as your existence. Because unless you're living a world where you're completely alone and you're fine with that, it's very hard not to cater to your community. Right? So that's, I think that brings us to that, whole, we need to acknowledge the fact of, admitting your differences, but also noticing your similarities. So you can see that, what makes you equal, what makes you equivalent. There's no one exactly like you, and that is a good thing. I believe that is a good thing. I think a lot of people have tried to make humanity exactly the same.
Yeah.
And it did not work, and it did not work for a reason.
Or if not all of humanity as one, but grouping people in such a way that everybody within that group is supposed to be the same.
Exactly.
And is defined, everything about them is defined as they're in that belonging to that group. As opposed to each of us belong to so many different groups and groups within groups, and that those all inform our individuality.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place for us to stop.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for
please
having
come back
me.
as often as possible, and you're going to bring in more people, like-minded contributors and so on. So we're looking forward to that.